Okie doke. So, the last video or two, we're going to talk about the application of this model. Start off short-lived local pollutants. Well, we talked about lead, seems to fit pretty well. Solos mechanisms. So, with lead, clearly the mechanism is shifting to a different technology, right? It's not about stopping travel, it's not about traveling in a different way, it's about stopping adding lead to the petrol. It's shifting to lead-free petrol or diesel, or these days electric, anything except lead. So it's the technique effect, and it's, in terms of Solos mechanisms, it's shifting to alternative inputs. So it fits really nicely. One thing, if you look in detail at the lead, so one thing is we shifted surely way too late, and that is of course because of suboptimal policy, vested interests, and so on. Sort of political science topic, really is super interesting. A lot of research could be done there. Another one is that all the countries tended to shift at more or less the same time. And that was partly the information thing, that there was a sort of realization finally that, oh, we're causing brain damage to our kids here, this is crazy. But also, it coincided with basically the leading economies like the US. They sort of said, look, you've got to have catalytic converter on your car to reduce the emissions of other pollutants like particulates and carbon monoxide. And basically any lead added to the petrol trashes and destroys the catalytic converter. So in a car with a catalytic converter, you can't have lead in the petrol. So that was another factor that meant that it spread very rapidly across the world. Whereas in if it had fitted our very simple model perfectly, you would expect to see low-income countries shifting out of adding lead much later than the high-income countries. But that wasn't really the case. It happened quite quickly. What about nitrates and phosphates from agricultural land? So those emissions have failed to decline. So why might that be? Is it because it's just not worth reducing the emissions? We don't care enough about the pollution? That's probably part of it. Is it because the farmers' lobby is so strong that policymakers don't want to act? That may be part of it. Is it because it's hard to find policy instruments to deal with non-point source pollution from agricultural fields? We can't sort of tax the emissions because we can't identify exactly where they came from. That is also probably a part of it. Okay. So lots more research to do there too. And of course, you could take lots of different cases and think through them, compare them to the model, and you see some things that fit, other things that don't. What about long-lived global pollutants? So obviously that means dealing with those is a dynamic problem, but actually that's pretty straightforward to add to the model. It's just some extra math. Optimal regulation requires global agreements. That, as we know, opens up a whole new literature and makes things much more complicated. The case of CFCs is an interesting one. There was compared to the model, there was a lack of information. We just didn't know about the damages they were causing. When we found out, those damages were very large compared to the marginal cost, or the damage of a unit of CFCs emitted was very large compared to the cost of not emitting that unit by using some other technology for cooling fridges, using some other substance other than the CFC, basically. So what that meant was that very quickly, once the problem was discovered, because of the very large damages in relation to the costs of shifting technology, the rich countries basically forced through a global agreement against the wishes of the poor countries, or the poor countries. Countries, for instance, such as China, who were at that time on much lower incomes. Average GDP was much, much lower than in the 80s in China than it is in Western Europe, or was at the time in Western Europe and the US. So Western Europe and the US, extremely keen, we have to stop this right away. China was more like, this is still costly, we don't care that much about the ozone layer. But the rich countries basically forced it through. And you can find literature on that, it's quite interesting. I think I refer to a paper on that in the growth pollution policy paper. Okay, so why might pollution not be optimally priced? Well, there's imperfect information, there's constantly changing marginal cost, makes it tricky for the regulator to keep up. It may be tricky to implement as with agricultural emissions. But basically, the basic intuition of the model survives all this. Like, we can say, well, if pollution is underpriced by the regulators, but never by a factor greater than n, you're going to see the same patterns. It's just that we'll always be acting too late, With a stock pollutant, of course, these things can get worse, because, and especially if you throw in sort of tipping points and so on, with uncertainty, we can, of course, there's no guarantee, despite this model, that we won't all die because of carbon dioxide emissions, because we may pass some point of no return before we realize, or before all the countries can get their acts together and agree on reducing emissions. Okay, how are we doing? The other thing about carbon dioxide is that we should never expect such a dramatic drop as we've seen, for instance, with lead and sulfur dioxide. Like, lead to the atmosphere all came from petrol, basically. Sulfur dioxide comes almost exclusively from coal burning. So we stopped adding lead to petrol, we stopped burning coal, or we put scrubbers on the coal-fired power stations. We can get like dramatic reductions in emissions quickly. But with carbon dioxide, there's a whole series of changes that need to be made with different marginal costs. So we've got a given social cost of carbon, which rises over time according to the model, and that motivates the introduction of clean technologies step by step. So the key clean technology that is motivated to be introduced now, or the key dirty technology which should be removed across the world according to the global price of carbon, is coal burning, right? If there was a global carbon price at like $100 a ton, or anything in that region, we would just stop building coal-fired power stations right away. We would have stopped years ago, and we would be trying to decommission those that are in place. And then over time we start going over like electric vehicles. We need to replace, find solutions for concrete. We might in the end have large scale carbon capture and so on. All these things will be introduced stepwise, unless, of course, like with CFCs, we realize late in the day that, oh my god, like damages are really, really high, that we hadn't sort of realized. I mean, and if we realize that late, if the policymakers suddenly change their minds about damages and ramp up their estimate of what damages are, then of course we could see sweeping changes across many sectors at the same time. But on a first best path, we would have step by step changes sector by sector. But the real biggie for now is coal burning, yeah, and that's made a huge difference in the countries like the UK or even Sweden, but that's going back 40 years. And we got rid of coal burning, fossil fuel burning for power generation. That made a huge difference. It made a huge difference in the UK over the last 20 years. It makes a huge difference in those countries where it's introduced. And of course, where you switch to gas, natural gas, that's a 50% reduction in emissions, basically. If you can switch to renewables, well, that's 100%. All the emissions will go. So that's, of course, much, much better. In the UK, we switched to natural gas. In Sweden, we switched out of fossil altogether for power generation. Okay. Policy implications, how are we doing? Yeah, I think, yeah, I'll go through this on the same video. So if shifting between technologies, and in particular the abandonment of obsolete, dirty technologies, is key to cleaning up, what does this tell us about policy? Well, of course, we need Pigovian taxes, but we don't need this model really to tell us that. It also tells us this pattern of rise and fall. It introduces the risk of lobbying, that it's like we optimally, on the first best path, we build up polluting industries and then we get rid of them again or make them change. But of course, once we've got all that capital there, they're going to lobby against that. So we need to be aware in advance when we're building up polluting industries that, hang on, look, in 20, 30 years, we're going to think this was probably a bad idea. So we need to think about that in advance. Should we even be investing in this in the first place, even though it seems like a good deal today, for instance? I guess that's kind of what I was thinking about. Of course, the Acemoglu paper that we talked about when we were talking about the workhorse, they put directed technological change at the center of their analysis. And of course, that's important, potentially. Well, it is important to getting these switches to clean technology. But it's an open question to what extent Pigovian taxes and the threat of Pigovian taxes in the future will drive directed technological change, technological progress in clean technologies, or whether we need research subsidies, whether they would do a better job either complementing or even replacing Pigovian taxes. That's not something I'm going to talk about, but it is something that you could look into for your extra essay or whatever we're calling it in the course. Okay, I think I've sort of talked about that. Yeah, so of course, when it's already time to phase things out, the regulator needs to get tough, you know. And often these changes, it's like large-scale changes. We can see that a technology is outdated. We don't actually necessarily need a Pigovian tax. We can just ban that particular technology. Like, no, there's no more power generation using coal in this country. We don't really need the tax necessarily. It's more about whether the ban or the tax is more politically feasible to carry out. What about like air travel? If you know that we want clean air travel in 10 or 20 years, how do we make that happen? Somehow we need to signal in a trovärdig, what do you call that in English? I can't find the word, like believable, credible. In a credible way, we need to signal to the aircraft manufacturers and the operators that like you're not going to be allowed to fly after some date unless you have zero emissions technology. That would be the key to stimulating the research necessary. Alternatively, if you can just signal that we're going to have, again, credible signals that we're going to ramp up the carbon dioxide taxes and that they are going to be applied on all sectors, including the air travel sector, which of course, as you know, those taxes, emissions taxes, are not applied on air travel at the moment. If you can credibly signal that they are going to be applied and they are going to increase over time as willingness to pay increases, that should also incentivize the necessary research. Okay, that's it for me. Whoa, I think that's my last video. I hope they're reasonably watchable and reasonably understandable, and I'll try and get some more written material out with exercises which will give you a clearer idea about what I want you to know coming for an exam, for instance. And then I look forward to meeting you for 3 classes in 2 or 3 weeks. Okay.